Welcome back to Political Capital. In the second half, we're focusing on the Constitutional Court case of Shaun Abrahams, who is the head of the National Prosecuting Authority and is challenging a verdict by his own courts. Let's begin by looking at the legacy of the Zuma presidency. Has it been a gift for or a curse for the law profession?
Well, from a jurisprudential point of view, it certainly has been a blessing. Never in the history of our democratic dispensation have we had a president test the constitution as much as the previous president has. Now we know what the limitations, the powers of the public protector are. We know what a motion of no confidence means. We certainly were getting close to understanding what impeachment means as well. So it certainly has been, from a jurisprudential point of view, a blessing.
Let's speak about the Shaun Abrahams matter, which is currently front and center for the legal profession, and it also has consequential weight for the country.
Yeah.
Does Shaun Abrahams have grounds to argue against what the High Court of the North Gauteng High Court has already pronounced? Can he still argue to retain his job when they deem it invalid?
Well, it's a question before the Constitutional Court, and I wouldn't want to preempt what the outcome will be. But the essence of his argument is that the former NDPP, Ngasana, left the position by resignation. What that means is a vacancy became available, and the High Court in Pretoria obviously was not convinced by the argument. And now it's the question before the Constitutional Court as to whether it's a valid argument or not. I suppose we're going to sit and wait for the outcome from the Constitutional Court.
Tell me, let's play out scenarios here. Let's see what happens here. I mean, the Constitutional Court can find in his favor or not. But, I mean, there's been so much cloud surrounding Shaun Abrahams, and largely from a public perception that says that he did not seem like he was in a hurry to prosecute the #1 citizen who had 783 counts that he could have pursued. If he wins this legal challenge, what does it say about his compromised public persona?
Well, see, again, it's one of the most important questions the Constitutional Court is going to have to deal with. There certainly is, in my mind, a valid concern about his independence. And it's a valid point which is being canvassed before the Constitutional Court as well. If he were to win this, then we've got a serious challenge in that law must not only be done, but must be perceived to be done. That is what public confidence is about. So if you have a person who's generally understood to be compromised, then, well, I fear for our national prosecuting authorities.
But you see, there's another thing, I guess, that's been in the mix. I mean, ever since the days of Dlamini-Zuma, who we knew was appointed by the Thabo Mbeki presidency or under his administration, and he was public enemy #1 for President Jacob Zuma because he looked as if he was pursuing these spy charges. The politicization of the National Prosecuting Authority and the impact that it has for a country like South Africa. Ultimately, one from the outside would be forgiven for thinking that, whoever is the head of the NPA is the president's man. Fair?
Well, yes, because, again, we're dealing with an issue here where quite recently, well, actually, as a matter of fact, yesterday, where you had Jacques Paul, the now infamous journalist, his house was raided. So the concern is, are we seeing a continuation of what we saw with the previous president and the president before him, Thabo Mbeki, because he was accused of the same issue, which is the politicization, politicizing the institutions of justice. So I think it's a fair comment in that it seems to permeate and doesn't seem to have a stop. And it's a big problem because, I mean, we've got case law to this effect that the NPA must be independent and must be seen to be independent. And for as long as that continues, I think the public is fair in losing confidence in these authorities.
So the other scenario, of course, is that Shaun Abrahams could lose his appeal with the Constitutional Court. Would that clear out the way then for the president, now President Cyril Ramaphosa, to appoint another NDPP head, or is there a motion of no confidence that has to be passed in him first before we can proceed to appointing a new head?
Yeah. Suppose Shaun Abrahams does not prevail in the Constitutional Court. What that means is the decision of the High Court in Pretoria stands. What that means is got to vacate office. And of course, the president then has to follow the necessary procedures to appoint a new National Director of Public Prosecutions. So that is what we're going to have to deal with. But the flip side of that is he might prevail. So his argument might prevail in the Constitutional Court. And then the question becomes, what does that mean? What that means is, in terms of the National Prosecutions Act, the processes must be followed to dismiss the NDPP, which would obviously involve Parliament as well. So if he prevails, he stays. If he does not prevail, he goes. And then, of course, the president has to appoint a new head of the National Prosecuting Authority.
And that, I guess, is another thing that we must all focus on. Now, there's been a lot of noise about who that head should be, because I think a great majority of South Africans are starting to look at Shaun Abrahams as yesterday's man, not necessarily a man who's going to take us into the future. Some names have been canvassed, but I think the makeup of the person is more important than the name. I mean, what kind of a person should the president be looking to appoint in order to save not just the reputation of South Africa's prosecution agency, but your beloved profession?
No, absolutely, and it's a good question. Ultimately, we're looking for someone with integrity. That's the sum total of it all, independent from political influence. And unfortunately, I'm hard-pressed to think of an instance where we're completely comfortable, at least from a public's perception, where we're completely comfortable with the head of the NPA. So it is about time we get to a point where we have full confidence in the integrity and the independence of the head of the NPA, which has been lacking for the past couple of years, to be frank. So that is what we're looking for. As to who that is a prerogative of the president. But ultimately, we're looking for qualities of independence, free from politics. We've got case law from the Supreme Court of Appeal. We've got case law from the Constitutional Court to the effect that it must be independent from politics. So I don't care who the name is or who is appointed as the NDPP. What I'm more concerned about, and what the public should be concerned about, is the integrity of the person who's being appointed to that position. And linking up to that, because we're also dealing with the question of the former head of NDPP, or rather of the NPA, Mr. Nxasana. That has been called into question as well, because we've gotten to a point where we had someone who's arguing now that was forced out of the position, and it took the 17 million golden handshake.
Handsome check.
Absolutely. So if he was concerned about his dismissal, why didn't he challenge it then? Why now? So that's the problem we're facing. So some people have been punting him as the savior of the NPA, but you must question his intentions. You must question why he took the 17 million. There are processes and procedures by which he could have challenged the president. He did not do that. So these are the things that concern, things that should concern the public. And
part of the High Court verdict was that he left when he shouldn't have, that it was an abuse of power by President Jacob Zuma in order to get rid of Mr. Nxasana. But then, if Mr. Abrahams is invalid, does that automatically validate or bring back Mr. Nxasana as head of the NPA?
Well, I mean, simplistically, I suppose your logic follows, but in law it doesn't quite work that way, because there are processes that you have to follow in order to appoint an NDPP. It can't be a default position. And ultimately, if it were to happen in the Constitutional Court that corruption watch prevails, what that means is now that is the incumbent president has to appoint a new NDPP. So it's not a question of default. The president still has the obligation of appointing the NDPP, obviously relative to what comes out of the Constitutional Court.
But now we find ourselves where Jacques Pauw's house is getting raided. Long after Zuma has vacated office and had his symbolic farewell dinner. And it seems that there's a continuation, if you will, of the same old forces that drove a certain narrative that was very closely linked to the Zuma years.
I don't think it would be fair on the incumbent president to draw conclusions on that logic, because as it stands, we still don't know what the basis of those raids were. It could have been legitimate, it could not have been legitimate, because you would recall from the previous administration of Jacob Zuma, the argument was that he is in possession of information that is not supposed to be in possession of, information that was leaked, personal information that was leaked by the South African Reserve, or rather South African Revenue Services. So I suppose it's a plot that's thickening. We'll wait and see what it means. I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that it has anything to do with the incumbent president.
Let's go back to the broader conversation. The National Prosecuting Authority.
Yeah.
How do we get the glory back?
Yeah.
If we ever had it, because, you know, that's arguable too, ever since the dawn of democracy.
Yeah.
It's always been a tool for politicians to really go after their nemesis, to silence people, to delay things happening. How do we get a National Prosecuting Authority that does not have any political ambition or display anybody's political nous?
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate. It's a valid question, but it's unfortunate in a sense that we shouldn't even be asking that question. It should be a matter of course that we've got public, or rather we've got confidence in the NPA. How we get it back is linking up to what I'd said earlier on. What we're looking for is the independence of the NPA. We're looking at the integrity of an NPA head who has got no political ambitions. Safeguards are put in place to protect them from politicians as to why they feel the need to satisfy the personal ambitions of certain politicians baffles my mind. But ultimately, it's a question of independence, a question of integrity, free of politics.
Thank you very much for being with us on this episode. Join us again on Tuesday at 6:30 Central African Time as we continue to follow the unraveling of this Gupta empire. Good evening.